replaced by the new Trident that's just being built. They have a much longer range than the Poseidon over here. They will have a range of about 4,000 miles, I think. Now, if you will come over here, I will show you how we launched the men to the moon.
This process of conditioning us to accept nuclear weapons and a nuclear arms race really got underway with a lie called the missile gap. The missile gap dominated headlines in the late 50s and 60s, especially following the launch of the Russian Sputnik, the first satellite into space in October 1957. And hysteria swept over the three American services. Sputnik, they said, proved that the Russians were ahead in missile technology. But this was not true. Indeed, the very notion of a missile gap was ridiculous, as every American scientist working on missiles now concedes. Dr. Herbert York, one of the most distinguished and key figures in the early development of nuclear weapons, wrote this in his book Race to Oblivion. By 1955, the principal inter-service battle had become a power struggle over who would get the juiciest and sexiest roles and missions in long-range missiles. When Sputnik went up, each of the services hoped to take advantage of the public confusion and consternation over Sputnik.
Sputnik did not really represent a big technological lead on the part of the Soviets. The two programs at the fundamental level, that is the American missile and space program, the Soviet missile and space program, were rather evenly balanced. In fact, the American program was bigger and somewhat ahead in terms of the technological base, but the Russians put up the first satellite, and so for the man in the street, that was what counted, and not more detailed questions about how the two technological bases compared.
As a result, an unprecedented missile building program began in the United States. This arms race was fueled by intelligence reports which credited the Russians with all kinds of technological wonders, including an elusive atomic-powered bomber. Again, to quote Dr. York, "Today it is quite obvious that no such nuclear aircraft ever existed in the Soviet Union, and that stories to that effect were simply one more very clear attempt to generate what may be called self-serving intelligence." Admiral Jean LaRocque, United States Navy, was number 2 at Strategic Plans Division in the Pentagon. That means he was a senior nuclear strategist. Before that, he was Admiral commanding the Mediterranean Nuclear Task Group.
We have been 3 to 5 years ahead of the Soviet Union in the development of every strategic weapon system that has come down the pike since we developed and exploded the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hydrogen bomb. We deployed our ICBMs first. We had the first jet aircraft to carry the bombs to the Soviet Union, the first nuclear-powered submarines, the first solid propellant missiles in our submarines. We went to MERV 10 years before the Soviets came up with their multiple independent re-entry vehicles.
When you say that the United States is 3 to 5 years ahead, that flies in the face of everything that we've heard from the White House, from Whitehall, everything our governments tell us.
Well, you just have to look at the facts, John. We have more strategic nuclear weapons than the Soviets have. We have 9,200 today. The Soviets, at the highest estimate by our government, is 7,000 strategic nuclear weapons. We have a bomber force of about 400 strategic bombers, all of them very fast, jet-propelled aircraft, the F-111s and the B-52s. The Soviets have only 140 strategic bombers. And of that, 100 are still old propeller planes. We have most of our nuclear weapons at sea, where they're secure. We have 5,000 nuclear weapons in our submarines. And we keep 3,000 nuclear weapons off the Soviet Union, day in and day out, and have done so for 20 years. The Soviets, on the other hand, have only 1,000 nuclear weapons in all of their submarines, and they keep 200 nuclear weapons off of the U.S. coast. By every criterion that you can think of, the United States is ahead today in absolute terms, and we're building in such a way that we are going to stay stay ahead, no matter what the Soviets do.
'Cause 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 'C Professor Lawrence Friedman is head of war studies at King's College London and formerly with the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
I think most people would accept that in quantity of military power, whether one's talking about conventional or nuclear forces, the Soviet Union has more numbers. It say has 1,400 ICBMs to the American 1,000. With multiple warheads, the Americans may have more warheads at the moment, but they're losing that lead too. So I don't think the argument is quantity. Quality is relevant. The United States certainly has been the pace setter in some ways on quality. But even then, I think the qualitative differences are not as great as they once were. The Soviet Union has, with an very proud of doing so.
For impartial analysis, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute enjoys a rare reputation. Its 1982 report says that America is up to 5 years ahead of Russia.
We believe in the Russian army. We believe in the skill of the Russian generals.
Birmingham, where in the shadow of the Queen Victoria statue and beneath the red flag, a vast crowd listens to a fighting speech by Lord Beaverbrook.
And we believe in Stalin's leadership. Yes, in Stalin's leadership.
I'm very, very glad to have met you. Very glad indeed.
Official truth or propaganda often depends on the image of a people whom our government wants us to regard as an enemy in order to justify its own foreign policies. As Lord Beaverbrook, wartime cabinet minister under Churchill, made clear, the Russians then were good Russians. Now take, for example, the Germans. These were bad Germans, although they were the same people as Willy Brandt's good West Germans, who live next to their communist countrymen in the East, who are, officially, bad Germans. All this may sound ridiculous, and it is. But conditioning us to fear and mistrust an entire nation of human beings is vital if we are to regard them as a threat. Remember the bad Chinese, the Red Guard, the Yellow Peril. Weren't they then the embodiment of the evil threat? And what are they now? Now, they're the good Chinese. When I last went to the Soviet Union in 1977, I interviewed many of those called dissidents, people who dared to speak out in a police state. Simple Democrats, you might call them, like the courageous Volodya Slepak, now in prison, and Irina Ginsburg, now in the West with her husband, Alexander Ginsburg. What I learned from these people was this. When international tension is relaxed, détente we used to call it, the Soviet bureaucracy finds it more difficult to justify open repression. And as a result, there is a dialogue, private and cautious certainly, but a dialogue on matters of war and peace, and in a country ever mindful that 22 million of its people died in the last war. Eventually, this dialogue finds an echo in the Soviet leadership, burdened by military spending and unable to feed its own people without imported American grain. When tension is relaxed, these reformist elements have influence, and the result has been a partial test ban treaty and strategic arms limitations. But when the West rattles its missiles, there is no dialogue and no echoes, only a state of siege, only danger. In the 1950s, at the height of the old Cold War, John Foster Dulles, then American Secretary of State, said, "In order to make people bear the burden, we have to create an emotional atmosphere akin to a wartime psychology. We must create the idea of a threat from without. The manipulation of statistics, sometimes known as disinformation, is one way of creating this wartime psychology."
If you read a statement by the American Secretary of Defense about the number of Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe, you'd probably take that as a hard fact. And if you read a statement actually issued in the same month by the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, about the number of Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe. You'd probably take that as a hard fact. And when you found out the Secretary of Defense said there were 31 Soviet divisions there, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs said there were 27, which was what they said in 1978, then you start by realizing there are no agreed facts.
Can you develop that from those diagrams with the tanks lined up against each other? Now, what's been left out of those?
The age of the tanks, for example. Some of the Warsaw Pact tanks are nearly 30 years old, much older than NATO tanks.
So they're not as efficient.
They're not as efficient, they break down more easily, they don't have as powerful guns, their guns aren't as